You are listening to EE Times On Air, and this is EE Times Current. I'm Taylor Marvin. Welcome to Brains and Machines, a deep dive into neuromorphic engineering and biologically inspired technology. In this episode, Professor Gordon Cheng talks about giving robots the sense of touch. Your hosts are Dr. Sunny Bains of University College London and Dr. Giulia D'Angelo of the Czech Technical University in Prague.
Welcome to Brains and Machines. I am Giulia D'Angelo.
And I'm Sunny Bains.
In today's episode, Sunny is talking about the benefits and challenges of creating artificial skin for machines with Professor Gordon Cheng of the Technical University of Munich in Germany. After the interview, we will be talking to Ralph Etienne-Cummings from Johns Hopkins University about the issues raised.
Thanks, Giulia. Gordon has been working on humanoid robotics for more than 25 years, and in the early 2010s started giving them a sense of touch. He succeeded, as a video search for Gordon Cheng feather robot dramatically demonstrates. In this episode, we'll find out why he felt touch was so important, how he chose to implement it, and why he thinks neuromorphic technology could solve some of the problems he encountered. There are links to his work and some of the specific papers we'll be discussing, including that video I mentioned, on our website. You can check them out at brainsandmachines.net. Gordon Cheng, welcome to Brains and Machines.
Thank you very much, Son.
Can you start by telling me what you studied at university and how you got involved with robotics?
Okay, that's a long journey. So I started in computer science, actually. Very nerdy, like to program a lot. One day, the Macintosh intrigued me, so I wanted to know everything about it. So I decided to study computer science. And then I finished my bachelor, my master at the university, and I thought I should go out into the real world. And I found a proper job. So I was actually in logistics. Nothing to do with computer, nothing to do with robotics at all. One day, a friend of mine from the university said, I have 2 PhD scholarship, do you want it? And it was in robotics. And then we started from there. So the funny thing is, the robotic that I did for my PhD has nothing to do with what I'm doing now. It was all about vision-based mobile navigation. It has some reflection in the inspiration that we were modeling in a loose sense, place cell, how rat and robot can coincide to actually navigate. And that was my PhD. I did one of the first high-speed, real-time, vision-based mobile robot navigator. It was fun.
That actually sounds familiar. I'm wondering if I read that paper or read that work. Where did you do your PhD?
At the Australian National University. So that was a lot of fun. I have to say I did not like Canberra. So that accelerated my departure.
So what was the path that led you from robotics generally to focus specifically on touch, especially parts of the robot that we don't think of as effectors, right? Like the outer skin.
Okay, so after my PhD, I had one question. I said, where can I go to do humanoid robotic? And the only place on the planet was Japan, right? So I went to my postdoc in Japan. We built my first humanoid there. And then fortunately, before I left, I got invited by Mitsuo Kawato. He's very famous in neuroscience for forward model, internal model idea. So he said he wanted to have a fusion of neuroscience, robotic, and engineering. And please come and head one of the department. And there I built 2 more humanoid robots. So I am a bit obsessed about these things. So the interesting thing, most robots, I think it's still nowadays, are position-based control. And they're very stiff. If you touch it, it will not do anything. There is a new trend of cobot, which uses joint torque sensor at the joint. And I built 2 humanoid robots with full 51-degree of freedom, right, with joint torque control. But that is very expensive. Yeah, I won the research lottery. So I created 2 humanoid robots that you can joint tool control. We did a lot of modeling of vestibular system and how interaction can be made, very sophisticated control, including something called passivity-based control. It's a form of energy-based control. Energy in, energy out, it should be equal, 0. And the interesting thing was that you can do very fancy control. And then I looked at it one day, this is very powerful robot. Right? All the robots that I built are very powerful. You can do joint torque control. That was interesting. But the sense of touch is there in a very rudimentary manner. You can only sense at the joint torque. But human with 5 million receptor or more, we can sense everything around us. And we can usually sense before we touch. That's a very intriguing aspect that I like. And when I was thinking about it, when you lose sight, when you lose hearing, you can still live a reasonable life. But when you lose touch, that is devastating. So I think there may be only 3 people on the planet that's still alive that do not have the sense of touch that we know of. So it's very intriguing. That's why after I was in Japan, when I came to start the institute at the Technical University of Munich, the Institute for Cognitive System, I was always interested in intelligence much more. The robot part is a vehicle I use to study different aspects of intelligence. Of course, physical intelligence is one of the main aspects. And if you want to move around physically in the world, touch is extremely important. So I thought that is very challenging. It was fascinating because I said, okay, I look around the planet, okay, who's been doing touch? I count about 2 people that made a serious attempt. But most people work on touch, mainly focusing on fingertips. I'm doing a workshop on Friday at ICRA in Atlanta, and most of the speaker is talking about fingertip touch. Right. So what I wanted to do was something that hasn't been done before, that is challenging enough. Usually when it hasn't been done before, because it's a hard problem. So I thought that was interesting to undertake. And my so-called evil plan is I want a fully autonomous humanoid robot covered with artificial skin that can sense the world through touch.
Right. And I know from talking to you before that part of your motivation is just to put the 2 things that you've already said together. It's taking these incredibly powerful robots, but making them safe because when they touch you, they know that they're touching you and they're not just going to blow right through you.
Yeah. So this sense of awareness is basically how we deal with the world. When we make impact with the world, if we can sense the touch, we can reduce the impact, right? And it's the same thing applied to humanoid robot. And it got very intriguing because I wanted to know more and more about touch, right? And if you have joint torque touch, you have one modality. And most of the sensory modality on touch around the world that people have been working on is also a single modality, right? And looking at biology, you have pre-touch. You sense before you touch. Of course, you have forces, you touch, and you sense temperature. And something that's very intriguing to our safety is vibration. We sense vibration very well. That's something intrinsic to a human or animal. It's a matter of survival, I guess.
So let's talk specifically about the robotic skin that you and your colleagues developed. That work uses conventional sensor technologies because presumably you just wanted to get something done.
Yeah.
But the communication infrastructure is more brain-inspired, which is, of course, what I'm interested in. So you use events, which are analogous to spikes in the brain, along with analog or asynchronous spike timing. So can you, first of all, just explain what motivated you to do it this way?
So there's a lot of detail in the whole process. It's not just about communication. We can start with the communication part. That was actually one of the key milestones. So the communication part and the actual use of event and what the community like to call it neuromorphic computing. So the problem that we were having in engineering is that when you get a sensor, you have something called a control loop. And then you ask your sensor, what is your value? And then you take those value, make some sense of it, and then you make the control. So if you have something like 5 million receptor or more, like the brain, it does not make any sense to ask your body, what is your value 5 million times? Right? You've just been bombarded with so much information that you do not need. And what is really intriguing for us was that this neuromorphic or event-based is that you only send information when something changes. So we designed a very elaborate architecture that taking in conventional technology and transforming that into an event-based system. So instead of doing standard neuromorphic technology or computing, we decided that we don't make the chip yet, right? Because we don't know what we want yet. So now let's make something practical. So we started covering large areas of surfaces of robots, right? One example, it's a dual arm mobile robot. So you have a standard industrial arm and covering that with robotic skin. You can sense proximity, you can sense force, you can sense temperature, you can give it a hug or what have you, right? Each arm end up with thousands of sensors. So we start putting one computer on collecting data for one arm. We started putting another computer on collecting data. And then I said, stop, this cannot go on because we're going to put it on a humanoid robot and it should be fully autonomous. So our humanoid robot is covering probably the entire body from shoulder all the way down to the feet. And that's tens and thousands of receptors. And then if you measure the control loop, it will start failing if you have more than 250 sensor cells. So I said, now we have to solve the data problem. How does the brain do it? The body will only send changes to our brain. This is why they call it event-driven system, which we like. And this is the basic principle of most of the neuromorphic sensors. We made it into a large area.
So let me just describe, and maybe you can help me a little bit, what your robotic skin consists of, because there won't be any pictures, although we will put links to videos in with the notes for the podcast. So in the skin that you designed, you have little patches that have, do I remember correctly, 5 different sensors on them that relate to things like slow mechanoreceptor, fast mechanoreceptor, 2 for vibration, is that right?
Yes.
And 1 for temperature, and you have an accelerometer as well, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, for vibration. Yeah.
So these are on hexagonal little patches that can be kind of clipped together to create any area of skin that you want. But you've used entirely off-the-shelf, sensibly, we should say, off-the-shelf sensors, so not anything special neuromorphic, because you want to actually be able to achieve something in a sort of academic amount of time to finish a project. So can you talk about that process and how you started designing this? Because I find it fascinating, maybe because I come from an optics background, so I'm always interested in the communications and systems. How you started designing the way they all fit together, because I think that's quite clever.
Okay. The hexagon was the best shape that we could find because you couldn't actually form any kind of shape based on the hexagon. We tried square, we tried all this, it was just too awkward. We went with the off-the-shelf technology because that's just the cost effectiveness also. Right, instead of waiting for the cycle of making a wafer and then bringing the wafer and then making the chip, we said, okay, we don't even know what we want. Why should we make a wafer? Right, we're very practical, but we keep to the truthness of how to create or imitate biological skin cell. So that's why all these modality, forces, proximity, acceleration, temperature, and all this, and then we connect them all up. Each one of these cells is connected through a network. So they have cell-to-cell communication. So it's more of a message passing. One cell passes a message to the other. So that is one of the ways that we believe that we can actually provide effective communication and effective transformation of the information that go across the whole network. So there's a lot of, I don't know if you want to call it tricks or inspiration from the brain. One of the things that we actually constructed, we imitated the homunculus. Because at the beginning we say, these are the modality, right? Great, they're modality. But now you have to put it on surface. And where are all the cells located? Typical engineering would be that you go down to the robot arm or whatever, you put the cell, and then you mark on some software table, whatever, where each of the cells is, and you number each of the cells. This is completely impossible to do it correctly and robustly. So the first thing we do is look at how the homunculus or a function of a homunculus can help us.
Hey listeners, just a quick interjection here that I should have made during the actual interview. Homunculus means something slightly different in robotics than it does in biology. In biology, it's a picture of a human that's been distorted to show how much of the brain is dedicated to certain kinds of sensory processing and control, giving it, for instance, huge hands, lips, and tongue. In robotics, the homunculus is more like the machine's internal map of itself, showing how all of its sensors, actuators, and other systems connect together. That's it. Back to the interview.
So what we embraced was the concept of body schema and spatial representation. So the brain is doing a lot of that for us. Right? So you have your sensory homunculus. So what we derive from these event or modality that we have on each of the cell is a sense of self-localization. So because we know one cell is connected to another cell, another cell, another cell. And what we detect is the orientation of each cell. And then we start reconstructing the whole surface. So that means you have a spatial homunculus.
So you put the skin onto the robot.
Yes.
You've connected up all of the hexagons. How does that calibration step take place? Do you, for instance, have some touch going around the robot so that it can feel where each of the patches of skin are?
So we were debating about what's the best way to do this. The best way we thought, and taking inspiration from biology, there's a particular concept called motor babbling. We move, and then we work out what do we sense, and we start connecting that. And the only technical part we need is the origin. Where is the original cell is start from? And then that's how we actually started reconstructing the shape of the skin cell.
So it's a kind of an afference where you're saying, okay, I'm moving and I'm just detecting which of my sensors are sensing this movement in what way. And that's how you're able to put together where they're located. Is that correct?
Yeah. And then you have to have an origin, and that's all you need. And then you start chasing it, traversing it, because you know the basic geometry of the cell. And then you start building the shape.
So, as we've discussed, the sensors that you used originally in this project are conventional sensors. Then you have a processor that essentially takes in that data and turns it into these events that can then be transmitted through your communications infrastructure, which is asynchronous.
Yes.
So, what I'm wondering is, do you imagine that these functions that are being done by conventional technology now, do you imagine them being done by neuromorphic technology in 5, 10, 15 years' time?
I think everybody's still going down the old conventional path, get more computing, right? That's what everybody's really doing. They just buy higher and higher computing power. So I just don't think that is going to be effective if you want autonomy. So my joke is always that if I continue the standard path, that I will need a house full of computers just to collect the data and try to process, right? And it's probably still don't process fast enough to control the limb to actually make it do anything useful. So I think we will hit the limit. And I think the event-driven system or some kind of effective way of getting high-speed computing and processing done is really needed. You can go down to, buy more computer track or increasing the computing power or whatever. I think the brain do it very smart, very smart. Why bother me when I don't need to process?
And of course, if you are just taking that route of buying more and more computers, then you have to house them and you have to tether the robot somehow, whether that's wirelessly or with a big wire, which you often see if you go into robot labs. There'll be a big cable connecting the robot to the computer brain.
Yeah. So I think that's why I said I want a fully autonomous. So the humanoid is fully autonomous. The robotic skin on the robot is energetically and computationally autonomous. So we don't need a cable. We use a cable because we work in a lab, but it's only one cable. And this is a very big proof that neuromorphic do make sense. The human body and the human brain make sense.
And of course, with robots, I think it's really the great example of the proof of the pudding is in the eating, because you can really see the effectiveness of what you're doing if you look at the videos of your robots. I believe you have one video where you touch the robot with the feather and it can feel that and move away so as not to bend the feather, which I just think is incredible. And I have not seen videos like yours before. I have not seen any other work that's quite the same.
I said, can it be sensitive enough? I can control it with a feather. And this showed the intrinsic safety that we can put on an industrial robot. Usually, most of the industrial robots are fenced, and they have lots of camera everywhere just to detect if anybody going near it. Right? If robot have self-awareness, it makes it very, very interesting and much more intriguing to interact with, like human. And I think somebody challenged me once. They said, can I give the robot a hug? And we gave it a hug. And we did dancing with it too. Yeah.
Your videos speak volumes, they're really very impressive. Okay, so another area that I know is important to you is the interaction between brains and machines. This would include decoding signals from the brain and nerves to control robots or prosthetics, and possibly having machines send feedback to the brain. Can you explain why you think this has potential in robotics as much as it has more obviously in biomedical engineering?
Okay. Actually, one of the motivation of doing skin is also helping people to regain their sense of touch. I do a lot of things in robotic because that's my platform. If I have new idea, I test it on the robot first. So our brain machine BCI work, brain computer interface work, we do a lot of decoding, and then we do all these basic things that are required. So imagine if you're paralyzed and you want to move your limb. The brain-machine interface is one way of actually help you to control a device to help you move. But one of the things that always frustrate me, and when I watch some of these experiments that we do as well, they do not get any feedback. Most of the BCI, most of the things that people create, they forget they've gone to the control level, but the feedback is actually even more important. And the paradigm that we use in our neuroengineering research is sensory substitution. So imagine if you cannot feel your feet touching the ground, okay? So what we do, we put our skin sensor on the feet of the person, and then we provide them feedback that you're taking a step, you're hitting the ground, right? The first thing you do is present it visually, but even more important, if you want autonomy, you provide some kind of vibrational motor that matches you touching the ground, either on the back of the neck, that we don't use that much, or on the back of the upper arm. So somewhere where they still have sensation, like a paraplegic patient, usually from chest down, they cannot feel, they cannot move. Having something telling them that they're touching the ground is really important. And also we've been working with MS patients that lose a sense of touch on their feet, actually. We were trying to do sensory substitution with them on that. So the skin cell actually fully applicable. And the nice thing is that we didn't just impact on the humanoid community about making better walking robot. We came up with new algorithm that actually contact of the feet to the ground is much better than the usual joint torque sensor they put on the ankle. And it's much safer. The robot is much more careful, and we can actually reduce the impact So just moving away from the conventional wisdom in robotic engineering, we look more to the neuroscience side. And I like that you bring up the medical side. I think that's what we need to create, technology to help people.
Absolutely. But the other thing that you point out in the science robotics paper that I saw was that getting information from human brains can also be helpful in training robots how to do things. Can you talk about that work?
Okay, so we have some work. I think now it become a trend, actually. But it's very hard to set up a lab to do it. Most robotic lab probably have trouble actually set up such a elaborate setup. So what we were doing is we set up a decoding system, like a EEG, that you put electrode on your skull, and we start decoding the signal from your brain. And there's a particular signal that is very interesting, which I like a lot. It's from the anterior cingulate cortex, very close in the upper frontal region, which give you early warning when something is wrong. So what we were decoding around that region was something called error-related potential. So anything that is uncomfortable to me or is wrong to my expectation, this trigger. So if you can close that loop, it's really intriguing. That means you can actually watch a robot doing something, and then the robot can just detect your error-related potential to correct itself, correct its behavior. So this is very useful in a way scientifically to get a very nice understanding how the brain reacts. And also you can use to train the robot to behave better.
Very nice. So there is a huge push to use all sorts of neural approaches in robotics at the moment. Are there areas where you think these are particularly fruitful? And actually, I'm just as interested in which areas you think are not fruitful that tend to be trending at the moment.
Okay, so I've been doing this for, a long time, more than 20 years. So usually I have the slide that I throw up that engineering can learn a lot from neuroscience to create more efficient and effective engineering devices. For example, the artificial skin was based on that. And at the same time, we can transform some of the engineering method back into neuroscience as model to explain about the brain. So this is a lot that people took control model and then try to explain how the brain deal with control. So that's very interesting. And actually, I found it very fruitful, especially from engineering point of view. We are creating much more effective system. The current trend is really this AI push. I like it a lot because that has a lot of practical usage. The use case is phenomenal. But I think they are still following the approach of getting more and more computers. I just heard that they're going to spend $500 billion on a data center or computing center, which is substantial resources, right? But can it scale forever? I doubt that, right? And they forget about this autonomy part. We are intrinsic autonomous, and putting that constraint help us study how the brain works.
Absolutely. And finally, I wondered whether you had any thoughts about the place that neuromorphic engineering might have in robotics in the future, and if you really think it has one. I
think it has. It's sad that some company have given up on it. I know that they closed a couple of groups on neuromorphic computing. That's sad. I think the dilemma is the chicken and the egg problem. People would use the technology if it has a use case, but the technology hasn't been created enough to satisfy the use case. So I think keep pushing the efficiency and the effectiveness is probably where we need to do as a community. That's why I use it, the artificial skin, I use that to promote the methodology. Although we didn't come from the community, we came in because I needed something that works.
Absolutely. And you wouldn't like to tell me which companies these are that have dropped their neuromorphic efforts, would you?
I think Intel closed the lab in Munich already. And the other big company is the telephone company that they are.
Okay. Gordon Cheng, thanks so much for coming on to Brains and Machines.
Thank you so much, Sunny.
Thanks, Sunny. It has been really interesting listening to Gordon, as we haven't talked enough about touch on this podcast, and he raised very important points, like talking about technology to help humans. And for more about Gordon Cheng's work, please go to brainsandmachines.net. Now, we welcome back our regular commentator, Professor Ralph Etienne-Cummings from Johns Hopkins University.
Hi, guys. Good to be back.
It is a pleasure to be here again. So Gordon goes beyond conventional robotics to a deeply embodied understanding of intelligence. And he recognized that touch is fundamental for a safe, autonomous physical interaction with the world. So he moved beyond joints and actuators to focus on skin and sensory integration. And he says, when you lose touch, that is devastating. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the association between proprioception and touch. I had this problem, and I tried to look at the problem with gain modulation and then the sixth visual cortex to try to understand if I can associate proprioception to the huge sensor skins that we have, right? But it's a problem because it's not scalable, right? So how do we look for association for this big, huge piece of sensor, which is the skin?
You mean like for the person to feel and understand the places in their bodies where things are being touched? Is that what you mean?
Exactly, yes.
So I look at it in a way similar to when you are exploring the environment, right? We have our vision or our sensors in our ears, and we understand how our hands and our effectors essentially interact with the world, and we can get a good sense of, oh, my computer screen is here, my mouse is there, my watch is over there, and so on, right? So you get to understand your environment. I see kind of the internalization of that, right? Effectively, is the inward-looking version of the world. So when you get the feedback from the sensors that is within your body, you in a similar way construct an internal realization of where your position are your arms and where things are touching your skin and so on and so forth. So instead of creating a realization of what's outside of you, you end up creating a realization of what's inside of you, right? So it's almost the same, but just one flipped in on itself, I would argue.
Mm-hmm. So he mentioned about neuromorphic touch sensors, and actually I need to mention that Chiara Bartolozzi, Simeon Bamford and Ella Janot already did that. So they came out with a neuromorphic capacitive tactile sensor inspired by slowly adapter mechanoreceptors. So I was wondering, do we have other examples, or they are the first and the only ones that has done proper even-based touch sensors?
So one of the guys who was involved in creating the original touch sensors, I think it's with Giorgio Metta and the other guys who are doing the iCub. So his name is Daia. I think he was doing event-based sensors as well. But I think what was interesting about Ella and Simeon and Chiara's sensor was the particular type, right? Because we've got the 4 different types of mechanoreceptors for touch. Some of them are better for pressure, some of them are better for vibration. And I think what they had done was to come up with an event sensor which was very specific to that particular mode, which hadn't been done before. But I'm not sure that they were the very first ones. I'd have to go back and look at my literature review.
And I think it depends on the years that we're talking about here. Part of the Revolutionizing Prosthetic 2009 that was supported by DARPA that led to the development of a lot of what we take for granted these days in brain-machine interfaces. One of the elements of it was touch, right? And you guys may remember Slimon Bensmeyer, who unfortunately has passed, but he worked on what he called a biofidelic representation of touch, right? Which was this notion that you could have the whole entire suite of skin deformations being translated into the SA1 signal, and the RA1 signals would look like going down the nerves in order to get as close a representation to what the brain would be able to see if you were to record from the somatosensory cortex. And along that way, temperature sensors as well as pressure sensors were constructed that went into the emulation of the prosthetic limb.
Yes. So it was interesting. You might remember that a few years ago, one of the Johns Hopkins, Nitish Thakker's prostheticist group won the Misha Mahawald Award. But when you look into those sensors, they're not actually neuromorphic sensors, right? They're sensors that are conventional and then do this encoding. Ralph, you and I were talking about it, and you weren't sure whether it was actually the Bains-Maya biofidelic or not. But either way, the codes were produced synthetically, if you like. They're produced using a conventional processor, whereas the stuff that Chiara and Ella and Simeon were doing are genuine. The sensor creates a signal which is immediately sort of in the analog domain turned into an event, as opposed to going into a processor to turn it into a set of events. In terms of Gordon Cheng's work, it doesn't really matter because his stuff is all off the shelf. None of it is strictly neuromorphic anyway, but
yeah, so this is where Sunny and I disagree big time, right? I believe in systems neuromorphics as opposed to device neuromorphic. I think what she's basically referring to here is when you go directly from, let's say, the physics into spikes, I would refer to that as being device neuromorphic. So you touch, you get spikes going out, right? If you go from a sensor that you then put it through a processor that then creates the right spike trains that can stimulate the nerves and actually produce the same sensation, to me, that's still neuromorphic. It's just now systems neuromorphic because you've got a few steps along the way in order to convert the signal into the right way. So I hear that Sunny is using words like genuine and so on, which clearly, we disagree there.
Just to come back on that, one of the reasons I disagree is because ultimately, it was funny, I was going down to London for ISCAS, and it just so happens that the guy who was sitting next to us on the train was a PhD student of Themis Padramakis at the University of Edinburgh. So we started talking about neuromorphic, and of course, you put two neuromorphs together, and they immediately start discussing the definition of neuromorphic. He said, well, can I suggest that we talk about low power? And I said, to me, that is the underlying purpose of neuromorphic, is that low power piece to me. Now, maybe that again is because I'm a physicist, although Ralph is also a physicist, of course. But what I would say is that the systems neuromorphic is getting you halfway there, right? It's getting you some of the, if you like, the architectural advantages of being brain-like. And so you're able to copy things that are in the brain that would be much more difficult if you were using a really conventional way of doing things. But then when you go the extra step and you have your underlying physical layer be producing these neuromorphic outputs naturally, or, on some level naturally, then that's what's taking you all the way there to getting you the power advantages.
Yeah, we can agree to disagree in some sense, because I still think that there are some ways you can get the power benefits. But okay, we'll take it from there.
Yeah, as engineer, I feel that usually what comes from the layer of physics that happens and the structure that gives you the response, it's so elegant that you can't, is non-negligible, right? But anyway, one thing that I think is very important, he talks finally about the elephant in the room. So he said that Intel already closed the neuromorphic lab and many other companies are leaving us. And he's mentioning the chicken and egg problem. People would use technology if it has a use case. But the technology hasn't been created enough to satisfy the use case. What do you think about this specific point that he made?
So I think timing is everything in development of these types of technologies, right? So something that comes too early does not get turned into an actual application as quickly as if something comes at the right time. So, and you can see that all along the way, right? In fact, Intel itself, before the Loihi, back in the 90s, there was the Etan chip, right? Which was, for all intents and purposes, an entire replication, if you will, of neural networks and implementation of backprop and so on and so forth. That was done at that time, but that died as well. And then Loihi came back in the 2000s and survived a bit. And now we're saying that it's going away. But at the end of the day, we have a number of startups now that are looking at the application space And you have like companies that are well developed. You look at Prophecy, right? Yes, they're having a little bit of difficulties recently, but on the other hand, you had 120 people, right? They still have 70 people doing this stuff, and that's in the vision space. And you have a company like BrainChip. I know there's a few other big neuromorphs, meaning people who've been doing neuromorphic engineering for a long time in our field, who are now running the technology part of that company.
It's got to be at least 30 or 40 people at BrainChip, because I was there last year. It's quite a lot of people.
Yeah, and they are putting out ideas and chips that are being developed very much with ideas of application right into it, right? There's a couple of companies as well there's one called Blue Mind, which is out of Canada, I think. And another one called, it starts with an S, but I can't remember for now. But they are actually analog implementation, multiple different examples of real construction of the kind of things that Sunny would refer to as genuine neuromorphic. So I think it's all coming around, right? Now people are starting to see where the applications are and how you would then convert these ideas into something that'd be useful for everyone.
Yeah, Ralph, if you could send us the links to those companies, we can put those in the notes for the show. The thing I wanted to add too was going back to the idea of touch, because I've just been writing the chapter of the book that's been about touch. One of the interesting points is that unlike sound and unlike vision, touch is actually a much lower bandwidth thing that's happening, in the sense that there's usually less going on, right? So if you think about somebody poking you, that's in a particular location. The dynamics of it are much simpler than full color vision with lots of pixels. So it really lends itself to the whole event-based structure of sparsity. But also, unlike with vision, which I think requires a lot of what I would call neuromorphic locality, some of the people working in the touch space, and this includes Gordon Cheng, have been able to do all of the processing essentially centrally. So once the events are sent, they're not processed locally, they're processed in some central brain. So there are differences between touch and other spheres of neuromorphic endeavor, if you like vision, or sound, which I've also been thinking about a lot this week. So it's an interesting area.
Well, I think it's coming. I mean, it's just, like everything is cyclical. And if you are too early, you get screwed. If you are too late, then somebody's already done what you want to do, right? So perfect timing is critical.
Yes, I do think that we are not entirely ready, but because we keep pushing the benchmark against classical ANN, against accuracy, which of course I don't think is a good metric for us, right? I think that if we will ever beat conventional ANN systems is in multitasking and integrating different sources of information together. I don't know what you think, because of course I'm an early career researcher, but this is my thought.
But, from a computation perspective, it turns out that a lot of the machinery that is responsible for processing speech as well as processing vision or processing touch are very similar. And this is just now my proposition, is that there's a reason for this, right? Because ultimately, if you are again going to combine modalities and combine information across multiple different sensing modes, you are going to have something that is consistent at some fundamental basis, and then you can build upon it. Right? So absolutely, the conjunction of all these different sensing types is important.
But then isn't it true that we need to, let's say, relieve the first early layers from these learning processes, like these heavy learning processes, and put the learning on top of... Later, because if you think about the skin or the retina, all of the things that happens there happens for structure. And then at the higher stages, you apply this heavy learning. I mean, don't take me wrong. I'm not saying that in the retina there's no learning at all. I'm not saying that. But of course, the real learning happens later on, right? Where all of this information are kind of mixed together and needs to be understood.
Isn't it about the difference between learning and adaptation? So you've got local in time adaptation to things that are going on, and then you've got longer term learning. Speaking of Themis Podramakis, who I know I mentioned before, he wrote a really interesting paper a few years ago about what he called palimpsest memories. Have I brought this up before? Forgive me if I have, where you're using the same memory cells to store both short-term and long-term memories. So you have your long-term memories stored, And then you can adjust those to store things in shorter term. So I think learning is not one thing or another. Like learning is not just the big learning that you're talking about, Giulia. Learning is a spectrum, just like neuromorphic engineering is a spectrum. And so it's hard to answer that question. I think at every point along the chain, things are adapting. And sometimes those adaptations will be relatively longer term than you might think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the development of touch sensors has been remarkable over the last 10, 20 years, right? I mean, we started off with a scenario where, very few people were really looking into the conversion of forces into neural codes. But eventually, because of projects like iCub, such like the revolutionized prosthetics, we had a lot of development at the conversion point itself. So the physics of turning touch and vibration and slip into neural codes, all the way through to the encoding itself that goes into providing the sensation, either for robotic system for the iCub or prosthetics for the RP2009. And folks like Jerry Loeb, for example, at USC, has developed some of the most incredible, fine, super sensitive touch sensors. And now the question is, how do you reuse them in a way that is useful, right? And I believe that's where the approaches like neuromorphics might be a good processing layer that would take those fine sensors and then turn it into the codes that would be either useful for computation or useful for providing sensation to folks with injuries. So this is a very interesting space that still needs a lot of us to get into it.
And I just remembered one last thing that I wanted to say, which is don't forget materials. So skin is one of these areas where having really interesting materials approaches could be important for stretching across machines. Now, one of the papers I was reading recently was talking about just using conventional electronics and having everything sort of attached to the robot, and then you just put the skin over it, right? Which is one way to go. But then there are other people who are working on organic electronics for these skin type applications. And because you don't need something that's super fast, especially not for touch, this is actually a realistic prospect. So that's something else we could maybe look forward to.
Yeah, Zilan Bao, right? Her paper in Science is an exact example of that kind of thing. Traditional neuromorphics folks may say, these circuits are not too complicated, are not, as advanced as some others. But the idea of using organic electronics to do all of it is really, really intriguing.
So guys, we could continue forever, but it's a good time to stop here. So thank you, Sunny, again for yet another great interview, and Ralph for your insightful comments as usual. In the next episode, Sunny, we talk to Gerd Kauenbergs from the University of California at San Diego. We hope you will join us then.
That brings another episode of EE Times Current to its end. Thank you for listening, and thanks again to our guest, Professor Gordon Cheng. EE Times Current is available through all the major podcast platforms, but if you get to us at our website at eetimes.com, you'll find a transcript, along with direct links to the other stories we've mentioned and other resources. Thanks for listening.